This is the first official series of my stories about Georgia and me being and living there and my adventures and some of the interpretations that I might have around it. I need to mention that this is how I remember it. So these are my memories and my opinions. I haven't been doing diary, maybe sorry for that, but so some of the things might be not exactly as they were, but rather as they have imprinted in my memory and how I understand what it was. And yeah, and in this series, I'm gonna tell a story about how I got to Georgia and my first trip to Georgia in late summer of 1998, and of course it's gonna be quite many series as I was thinking around this videos, and I understand that there are so many stories in those 22 years of my experience so far with Georgia that it might take a while for me to tell all those stories, and as I try to remember new things and new stories and new adventures pop back into my mind and my memory that I felt that I've forgotten them, but they came back. And so and one more thing before we even immerse in those stories, it's I need to mention several things. One thing is that I mentioned also in the introduction is that I was quite young. I was not yet 24 when I went to Georgia first time. I have been in few foreign countries, in Belgium and Ukraine, I guess, due to my work in Procter & Gamble for business trips, but not that I've been traveling a lot, and not that me and my wife would have experience of going to southern countries, to warm countries, to mountainous countries. For those who are not familiar with the geography or landscape of Latvia or Baltics, we're very, very flat countries. So our highest mountains are what we call mountains are around 300 meters, not 1,300, but just 300 above the sea level. So it's very flat. And so there were very many new experiences for me, new things happening in my life for first time in my life. Like a lot of new things happening first time in my life happened during that first trip. Another thing that I need to mention is that in '98 was already 7 years since Latvia regained independence, and after regaining independence, a lot of what you would call economical or structural changes happened. So, for example, a lot of car fleet that used to be old Soviet or just ex-Soviet built cars was majorly transformed to second-hand cars imported from Germany or wherever. So car fleet shifted from Soviet-type cars into even used but still already Western cars. We had some new retail popping up, so there were some self-service supermarkets appearing. That started the wave of what do you call the transformation of retail landscape, and from private-owned, single-standing, rather small over-the-counter shops and bazaars into sort of modern type of retailing. It was just the beginning of transformation, so there were like major part of that actually happened after 2000, but still it was already happening, and there were it felt quite safe already, so it was not anymore the criminal sort of climate was decreasing, or at least getting into some kind of form and shape in wherever it was happening underground. So it was not that common public would get across to the what we called bandits. But so there were a lot of changes happening in over those 7 years. It was still very beginning, but they were like very significant changes. On the other side, Georgia was war and civil war torn country. So over those 7 years, from 91, which was also a regaining of independence for Georgia, there were many not very pleasant happenings happening in Georgia, including civil wars and refugees. And so during those 7 years, Georgia was probably, like structurally, infrastructurally, losing versus what it was before, because of wars, because you're not building new roads when there is a war, and of course many people got poorer due to, they were out of their homes, and they just, whatever they had on their backs, they moved to new places to live and all that. So there was a significant difference in income levels and life standard in Georgia versus Latvia, and of that period. And so it was quite significant shift from one life standard to another life standard. Even though, I mean, on a scheme of big things, we were probably very close, but on a scheme of comparing Georgia and Latvia and how we lived and they lived, it was the difference was very, very visible. And yeah, so my first adventure happened when we one more thing, something that we are used to in living in 2020 is that there are no borders. But back in '98, there were borders and passport checks and probably stamps in your passport, even when you crossed from Latvia to Lithuania or to Estonia. So there was no Schengen for Latvia back then, and there was no Schengen for Georgia, obviously. But even Latvia was sort of having all the border controls and everything that. And there are many things that in '98 they are still things to come, like free movement, European Union, Euro. All those things are yet to come, even globally, because there was no Euro in '98. And yeah, so my first adventure was getting there. So we had to have a Georgian visa, but there was no Georgian Embassy in Latvia. So we and there was very mixed or messed up communication around. Our Georgian partners were saying you can buy visa in airport. And when our assistant called to Georgian Embassy said, no, you cannot do it. You have to come to embassy in Moscow and get visa from embassy. This is not possible to buy visa in airport. And we had several communications back and forth with Georgia. And I said, no, it's okay. You can come, no problem. And embassy says no. And of course, I mean, to be safe, we picked the safe solution. Go to embassy, because official embassy says that you have to come to embassy. So we had to fly to Moscow and then fly from Moscow to Tbilisi, and there were no direct flights from Riga as well. So we would probably fly through Moscow anyway, but we would not stay in Moscow over several nights that we spent in Moscow. And again, I mean, there was no online ticketing in '98, so you had paperback ticket, and I had ticket that was for the certain date and time for Riga, Moscow, and I had to leave to Tbilisi, so I had to get that visa within a certain period of time, and a few days, and then get further on. And of course, you have, I mean, again, if you remember '98, I mean, your internet or your email, it was dial-up internet. So if you're lucky to dial up and if you're lucky to get connection, you would probably get some emails or something. But there was no Google, there was no Google Maps or Waze or whatever that would tell you address and everything. So it was a bit of, all type of thing. You had address and then you had to navigate somehow to get there. He's using maps or asking taxi driver to get you there. So we landed in Moscow. We got to hotel. We agreed about trip to Georgian Embassy. And when we got to Georgian Embassy, it was pretty shabby building, like 2 or 3 story building, at least in my memory. The entrance to embassy was consulate, not sure, but the entrance was sort of from the backyard, so it was not front entrance. And when you got there, it was just type of an office that you would see a lot in '98. Just an old sort of corridor with several rooms and maybe 2 or 3 rooms and not in fantastic shape, nothing fancy, and it didn't felt like an embassy. It felt like a common office, so whoever it is, but not really embassy. So there was no this embassy feeling, and it was like, nobody was really expecting this, and it seemed that ambassador or whoever it was had other stuff more important than running embassy, probably running some private business in Moscow. So it was a bit of like, yeah, can we do it, can we not, and all this worries around will we get visa on time and some things like that. But anyway, we filled the applications, we gave the pictures, we paid the money that we had to pay for visa, and we got the visa. But it was all the like, is it really embassy? Is this guy really ambassador? Are we really getting visa? And we got to Georgia, and we landed in Tbilisi, and well, the first thing is that obviously when just exiting airplane, all this southern air with the southern warmth and smells of south was something very new and something that I haven't experienced before. The sounds, the smells, the everything, and then even the low mountains around Tbilisi that you can see from airport in Tbilisi felt like, wow, mountains. Of course, and there are days to come in my story when I would see the real mountains, and mountains around Tbilisi would feel just whatever, regular. But back then it was like, wow, everything was a big surprise. And then back then there was no new airport of Tbilisi. It was still the old Soviet airport. Again, kind of with attempts to keep it, a bit better looking, but with the resources available and with the, it was pretty shabby. But it was okay. It was not to overstress that. It was okay. It was just not fancy, shining, whatever airport that you can think of when you imagine the capital cities around the world. And the Riga airport back then also was not like as it is now, right? So it was way smaller than it is now, and I'm not sure that any of the new terminals were yet built at that time. But then, of course, the order or the way you are handled in the airport was a very different experience in Tbilisi, because back then, there was no kind of real queuing. It was a bit like a big crowd trying to get through the 2 or 3 border passport check guys, and it was very slow. So I guess you would, back then you would spend several hours just to get out of the airport, or at least an hour. You're just queuing, and people are going around the queue because they know the guy, and or they have the relative working in the airport and something like that, and you're just waiting and waiting and waiting, and it's so slow because everything is either manual or with one finger with the computer. Anyway, we got through, and then you get the luggage, and then you are welcomed by a crowd of taxi drivers offering their services. Come with me, all that stuff. Those people who still travel to countries to South sort of Middle East or Central Asia or countries. You still have that, right? You still have, and even now in Tbilisi, you still have people approaching you in the arrivals, saying taxi, come with me. But back then it was like crowd of taxi guys who would try to get you and go, come with me, and they will cheat you. I'm not gonna cheat you, and all that stuff. But we were met by Tomas. Tomas was one of the co-owners of Arti, which was distributor of PNG in Tbilisi, and Tomas was like, if you have any kinds of stereotypes around Georgians or Italians, he was just perfectly fitting my idea of Georgian in '98. Tomas is quite tall, dark hair, darkish, not very dark, but darkish skin versus mine. He had those Italian, we call them Italian sunglasses, like this type of a shape, right? If you know, or sometimes you have in movies about the pilots, you see those. And he has that, and then we go to his car, and it's a black Audi. And then he drives a bit like a crazy. Not very. He was kind of not the craziest driver I met in Georgia, but still. And well, I think Tomas was not driving crazy. It was just that the traffic in Tbilisi was very much different versus traffic in Latvia. So it was a lot of and a lot of horn and a lot of that, rather than it was really crazy driving. And we got to the only international hotel back then, which was Sheraton Metehi, and for years to come it will be the only international hotel in Tbilisi. And so there are many things. Again, if we think about Georgia, there are many things to come. From back in '98, and we were met by Jim Kennedy, who was my first boss in Caucasus, and he was American with relations to Kennedy family, as he mentioned. But anyway, we went to Arti, which was located in Tbilisi in Sanzona. For those who know Tbilisi, in Sanzona, and I think this was, in a way, a very good time for Arti, because they were growing at that point in time, and they were gaining their share and but of course it all was a bit weird versus looking into how it was back in Latvia, and we had back then we had Dutch origin distributor was pretty modern warehouse, and of course, if you can imagine the warehousing in Georgia in '98, it was just the ordinary two level warehouse on the floor, no shelves, very primitive technology and everything. So it was a bit shocking, but and the two police guys with machine guns guarding the entrance to office were also a bit shocking. On the other hand, Arti was feeding all of the workers, so there was free free lunch for everyone. So there was a kitchen and place you eat. So there was a lot of other things which were also positively shocking. And we went to see the retail, as this was business trip. We went to see retail, and retail was mostly what we would normally call a convenience type of shop, which was over the counter, not very big, and then few shops which were sort of for foreigners or for rich people. Like one which survived, I think, the longest in Tbilisi was famous Big Ben, which was the only, at that time I think, was nearly the only one with a self-service type of a shop, and it was extremely expensive versus what was happening on the street, but still self-service. And then we went to the Dinamo Bazaar to see where the real business is made, because most of the sales for Arti back then were done in Tbilisi Bazaar, and we spent amazing amount of time in Tbilisi Bazaar, and I was in suit and tie and everything, and it was hot. It was so hot. And we went to dinner in restaurant Europa, which was again the only white restaurant was White Sheets, which was a single standing restaurant inside of Sheraton. And again, years to come before sort of designed restaurants will appear in Tbilisi. And don't understand me wrongly. You could eat in Tbilisi. There were a lot of places you could eat, and fantastic food. But they were just looking the way that no foreigner would be brought there, especially. And of course for Kibar and Arti it was not less. How do you call it? Exciting moment, because I was the first PNG representative to probably come to Georgia if I like it. And I can only imagine what was happening in Kibar's head when he thought of that. His company was pretty young, and I was the first one to be in Grad. So he probably wanted to impress or whatever. But and he was also not very old person. So he's slightly older than me. But still, it was he was still pretty young, and his business was pretty young, and PNG was like 100% of his business. So it was a very important visit for him. So he was trying to impress us. And yeah, so it was very interesting contrast of and meeting all those stereotypes and in person. So it seems that I will tell you in my next story. As this is taking quite long. I will tell you about my trip to Armenia during my first trip to Georgia, because as it was look and see, I was supposed to see both countries that I'm about to manage, which was Georgia and Armenia. So we had to go to Armenia for a trip to Yerevan, and that was another sort of an adventure to get there. So if you're watching this on YouTube, please push subscribe so that I get a bit of external motivation to continue these stories. And if you like the video, I would appreciate your like below the video. And yeah, the next series will come up in few days from this one, and I will be telling you a story about how I got to how was my trip to Armenia, and then we will proceed to my first visit to moving to Georgia, which was another adventure. So have a good day, and see you in series to come.